Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures' daily dose of nature, Beyond the Bears, the hidden beauty of Churchill's tundra ecosystem, with expedition leader Christina Disney. Christina, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Colby. I was very excited to get to hone in on Churchill and to get to hone in on the side of Churchill that most people don't see. So yeah, my name is Christina Disney. I've been a guide with Natural Habitat since 2018, but I've been working in Canada's north for a while. And my goal of our presentation today is to steer your eyes away from this view. I know this is what many of you are so excited to come north to get to see, that yawning wake up. It's what you fly so many, sometimes thousands of miles. It's where you bring 3 batteries for your, your camera so that it doesn't freeze. But I'm hoping to steer us away from that big, beautiful bear and take a look at the background, because I get as much joy out of this view, I think, as I do out of those bears. And so Colby here has given me just about an hour to try and change your lens to see the north the way that I see it. And that's a hard competition when I have things like this to compare to, right? I'm going to try to get you to take a look at some of those willows while you're maybe for the first time getting to see juveniles practicing sparring. And there is an excitement there, right? But it's of a different kind if you take a look at the wilderness. And so what we're looking at here is a thicket. It's a mix of dwarf birch and willow. And what we're seeing in the wintertime is a very, very different perspective in the summer. If you have the chance to go up north in the summertime, it's one of the most startling places you'll ever be, because if you think about it, their growing period is condensed to such a short time, right? It's sometimes get to near total darkness in the winter in contrast to almost complete daylight in summer. And so life really takes off. And this photo here is one of the first places that I went to work in the subarctic, and I guess reeling it in and thinking about specifically natural habitat guides, we come from many different backgrounds. Some people are experts in conservation. Some have been working with bears in different capacities for years and years before they come and work with NatHab. And you could say that Natural Habitat found me, or I found NatHab because of my love of the north. I've been working up there in different capacities, and eventually, thanks to them, made my way to Churchill. I'm super grateful for that, and grateful to find another perspective. So this is actually the helmet I used to wear to my very first field job, and so I thought this was a funny shot to invite you to take a look at the north from my perspective. So as a kid, my love of the north, of Canada's Arctic and subarctic, actually began with this book. In grade 5, I had a teacher, his name was Mr. Myers, very introverted gentleman, very quiet, and didn't really like the rowdy kids, but he loved to read to us. And we loved when he would read, because he had one of those melodic voices. It was fantastic. And I remember him reading this and painting this picture of this landscape that was so, so hostile, but yet so alive in these different ways that we don't often think about. And that was my first attraction to go. And so I ended up going to work in Hudson Bay. Was my very first job up north. But I was not on the Churchill side. I was not on the Manitoba side. I was actually working on the Quebec side. So I worked in a town, well, more aptly a village called Kujarapik. It was a very interesting place to have the opportunity to live and work. It's one of the most southern Inuit communities and the most northern Cree. And so historically, they lived on either side. There's a river that divides. And so north of that was Inuit and south of that was Cree. And so now the town is divided too. It has, imagine a little town. I don't think there's even, it's a flying community. I think there's maybe 1,000 people. You'd be lucky if there was 1,000. And so there's like 2 grocery stores, the roads are different on each side. It was a very fascinating place to get to live and work. But no matter where you go in the north, whether you're in Churchill or whether you're in Kujarapik or going north, this is a pretty common scene that you're going to come across. Completely windswept, and you got to wonder why are people choosing to live here? I know from some of you who are watching us from maybe some of the southern states or more southern regions, right? You're maybe shaking your heads at who comes all the way up here and comes to stay. And then you have to contrast that in the summertime when you'll get covered with bugs. And I think this might be a bit choppy, but this is the interior. So the beauty of Churchill is that you're on the coast, right? So you're going to get those breezes and keep the bugs at bay. But this is this was my friend Albin working, and yeah, it's a little choppy. But in essence, you can see that the bugs are there, and so you've got ice in the summer and bugs in the winter, and not exactly the most inviting of places. And so statistically, you can actually see that in Canada's demographic, that the north is relatively uninhabited. And I guess one thing that we often don't think about, but is that 90% of Canada's population lives within 100 miles on the border of the US. That southern fringe, and we have a huge expanse of land to the north. This hugging that's relatively speaking quite unpopulated. And so if you're one of those people who does live up north, there are some jokes for those of us who live and work up there in a more regular or permanent basis, is that everyone is south of you, right? You always say, oh, those southerners. That's a pretty common joke you'll hear. And then another thing is that when you go up north, even though it's such a vast place, you always feel like you run into the same people. And I feel that personally, but as I spent more time up there, I definitely dove into a bit of the history, right? And so we think of, we think of going north, but there's people who have been living there for really thousands of years. So you have the pre-Dorset culture, which we actually can't identify at this point whether it was a singular culture or multiple ones, but those have been the pre-basis that are there. That would have been, I think, somewhere around like 3000 BCE. And then you have, after them come the Dorset and the Thule. So the Thule are the precursor to what we consider now the Inuit people. And so this sort of gives you that time image, right? You can look and see, because we're a bit more familiar with, of the Norse coming, at least in Canada, right? So we know that the Norse come and they're in Iceland, they're in Greenland, but then they also come to the east coast of Canada for a point. And there's stories in Inuit culture of these traders coming through, and that oral history has been passed down to us. And so even though there's this vast land, there's a huge network of trading happening. And again, this is one of post-European contact, but just to sort of emphasize, there's this huge tract of land where these nomadic people have been living, and it's very well connected. And so the sense of community there is really, really strong. And it has to be, because when you live in such a crippling environment, you really have to band together to survive. I think this is such a lovely photo. This is a group of Inuit children from Nunavut, which is one of Canada's most recent territories. I often forget that for my own generation, right? It only became a territory in 1999, splitting off from the Northwest Territory. So it's still this ongoing living, right? But for those of us who aren't born there, we often see it as the final frontier. If you get the itch to go north, it's got that same sort of feel as Star Trek, right? There's something about it. There's something that pulls people in, and all these different characters. And if you so happen to be coming to Churchill this fall, I would love to tell you the story about Cowboy Larry Smith and the first pair of beaver mitts and the parka that I was gifted my first winter living up in the Yukon. He was quite the character, but that's an aside. So yeah, that's what I was saying about community. When you go and live up in these places, you make friends who become family and stay with you for forever. So I have another friend who's moving up there. She just moved actually last week, and even though she's moving to a completely different town and whatever, we tend to say, "Oh, I'll see you in the north." It's a very common expression because you tend to cross paths with the same people even years later. So all of this is a roundabout way to say that when we travel north, very excited that Churchill's on the books this year. For me, it's like going home. And so when I'm there with you on the buggy or on the rover, excuse me, then I feel like I'm going home. And not that Churchill has necessarily ever been somewhere I've lived outside of polar bear season, but there's something about the north that no matter where I've gone to, it feels like home to me. And so that's what I'm really hoping to share with you today. I'm hoping that you'll fall in love. You're already in love with the bears. I don't have to win that argument, but I'm hoping you can fall in love with the North the way that I have. So coming off the plane, coming to Churchill, this is going to be a pretty common sight that you'll see. You'll see that the roads are packed. The snow is shiny from the wind blowing across it so much. And if you look just to the right of the lamppost in the middle, you can see a bit of a rainbow there. And that's what we call sundogs. And probably, depending on where you're from in the world, you've probably seen them before. They're not exceptionally rare, but they do require a certain set of conditions in order to happen. So meteorologists actually call it diamond dust. So what happens is that there's a lot of moisture in the air, and it gets quickly, and it forms ice crystals in the air. And it's not the same as a snowflake, but still it does have that sort of hexagon structure in the ice. And those crystals begin to sort of fall, and as they fall, they lay horizontal. So you think about it as, you know, when you watch something like a feather slowly falling. So imagine all these ice crystals slowly falling, and so the light hits them and refracts, and it refracts with the red on the inside and blue towards the outside. And then it will continue to, and then the larger those crystals are, the longer, so vertically, the greater in length those sundogs become. And again, because of that hexagon shape, it's why those are always 22 degrees to either side of the sun. So you know that the weather's shifting for the colder when you see one of these when you look up into the sky. Another thing that you will have a chance to see coming north is the ptarmigan. And though, again, not overly rare, I would say that sighting them can often be very, very rare, because you can see they're quite the masters of winter disguise. They blend right in. And their Latin name is Lagopus muta or Lagopus. There's two species that we have in Churchill. So we've got the rock ptarmigan and the willow ptarmigan. And that name actually comes from, it's almost like rabbit foot or rabbit feather, because around their feet, right, they're staying up there all winter. There's lots of birds that come to the Arctic, feed in the summertime, and then fly back south to a warmer place. But the ptarmigan stays all year round, molts its feathers, changes, and has very, very fluffy feathers around its feet in order to help keep it warm. And it actually even helps almost as like a snowshoe as well. The extra fluff gives them a little bit more to push against with the snow. And so this is what we see them as in the winter. But if you're lucky enough to come up in the summer, or if you end up working up there in the summer like I was, you'll get to see these little beauties. They used to follow me home on the quad trail from a field job. I would see them every day or every other day, watching them grow up. And they grow fantastically quick. So there's usually anywhere between about 6, sometimes up to 12 in a nest. Within a day of hatching, they're all able to walk and run. Within a week, they're all able to essentially fly, or they can lift themselves off the ground and flutter. So they grow insanely quick. And there's an interesting thing that happens. So the female, if you guys look in the bottom right, if you haven't already seen her, she's looking directly at me in the camera. But even in this photo, I sometimes double take and have to look for her because she blends in so well. And so what happens during breeding is that the female changes and she molts into her summer colors, but the male actually stays in his white feathers. And so he's almost, it's a twofold attractant. It's an attractant for the females, and it's also attractant for the predators come spring. So very dicey time to be a male ptarmigan. And this is sort of fun. So if you're up on the rover and we finally see a ptarmigan and you're trying to spot the difference between the two species, I like to say that the rock ptarmigan is very, very dramatic, very flamboyant. They have the eyeliner effect. That's the easiest way to tell the difference between the two species. The other thing about ptarmigans, which I couldn't quite resist mentioning, is the infamous story of Chicken, Alaska, where the local residents couldn't decide what they wanted to call their town. They wanted to call it Ptarmigan, but none of them could agree on how Ptarmigan was spelt. For those of you who don't know, there's a silent P at the front of it. And so instead, they all agreed to call it Chicken. And it is still on my own personal bucket list to go to Chicken, Alaska. Another friend who we will hopefully see returning this fall, or when we return this fall, is the Arctic fox. When I was an undergrad, I actually did a study on them. I did a desk study, but I was digging through all these things because I was learning about their heart rate and their metabolism and circulation. And I found this really great story. It was written by these explorers, probably would have been 1800s, who were going through the Northwest Passage, and they got frozen in. And what they did was and they were fine actually, right? So the ship's frozen in, but they've got enough food supply. They knew this could happen, so they'd planned ahead, and they had enough food to last until spring. So it was going to be a rough winter, but they could make it. But the problem was that the rats on the ship were eating away their food supplies. And it just so happened that one of the sailors caught and tamed an Arctic fox. And they got this idea because they'd seen the Arctic fox. It was very, very good at hunting. They have an insane sense of smell. They can smell carrion, so they can smell like leftovers from, let's say, a polar bear eaten on a sail close to 20 miles away. And so and also they can smell things under the snow. So like, let's say there's a frozen lemming, they can smell that under the snow. And what they'll do is they'll jump and they use their paws to break through the crust of the snow, and then they'll dig down and get their food. And so the sailors, having seen how adaptable they were, got this idea. They took the pet fox, they put it in the ship, they boarded up the ship. They actually took out all their food, they took out all their supplies, and they camped on the ice beside the ship, but they boarded up the fox in the ship with the rats. And they didn't open anything up for, I think, almost a week is what I read. And when they opened it up, the Arctic fox was super fat. It had eaten every rat in the ship. And the sailors went back and they survived that winter because the fox kept all the food for them. So yeah, very adaptable little creatures, very adorable. And I don't know, I'll try this. We'll see again. Quality maybe isn't on par, but yeah, that this was the first winter I moved up there, and I made the mistake of putting the garbage out too soon. And this little guy here came and found it and actually stole our shoes. So there's there's a reason why the fox or the coyote is often the trickster in mythology. They're very clever. And if you'll notice, this one has a tracking collar on him. So I don't condone having mistakenly left the garbage out, but it was a good learning curve because you see that the collars they actually track them with. And they'll see them cover distances on the ice. They'll go between Canada and Russia. They're amazing little migrators. And so I feel like I've been contrasting, thinking about, we've got the ptarmigan in the winter. We're looking at the Arctic fox as you're going to see it. And truly, when you go up there, it's going to be a world of whites and grays and browns and golds and blues as things reflect. But the summer is a whole different set. Everything truly comes to life, or at least on land it does. And so this is a bog I was working in, again, quite north, quite subarctic. You can see the trees are very small, stunted, very open, right? It's a hard place to grow. And actually, I can remember this day specifically because that lovely rainbow came after one wicked storm. And I think about 5 or 10 minutes before this photo, my field partner was trying to set up their tent, and we were running because the tent was blowing and it was getting tumbled over, and we were chasing after this tent, but there's no trees to stop it. So we probably chased it down for, I don't know, 200 feet before we eventually caught up to this tent in this windstorm. So this was a beautiful moment, both for the view and for having retrieved the tent. And so I find that when you live up north, you have to look at the little things for the beauty. We get caught up in big sweeping landscapes, but if you take the moment to look down, you get to see beautiful things like this. So the flower on the left is a Kalmia polifolia, and the flower on the right is Andromeda polifolia. And those are bog rosemary. I'm sorry, bog rosemary is on the right. And I oddly can't remember the common name for Kalmia right now. It might be leatherleaf. I'm not too sure, but I always thought it was these beautiful little things, and you can see them popping through, and they survive in these very harsh, very nutrient poor conditions. And you can't talk about the north or flowers without talking about Labrador tea, which is Rhododendron grolandicum, or it used to be called Ledum grolandicum. It has, especially in the heat of summer, when you get that like July heat and really hot, sort of humid day, if you walk into the bog or you walk into even into the forest, right? There's a really heady scent that comes excuse me, that comes with it. And I would almost compare it to, I mean, the closest comparison might be like an Earl Grey tea. It's not really like that, but it has that same sort of very strong sense, which is partially, again, why it's called Labrador tea, is because it's been used, like old traders and things like that used to cut it in with their black tea to make the tea last longer. And we used to make tea with it in the summertime as well. It's fantastic. I would say probably top 5 favorite smells in my whole life. And of course, we can't overlook what actually makes up most of these wetlands in the Arctic. There's another guide named Eleanor, and her and I have been secretly vying to do a whole topic on moss. So if that interests any of you, please let us know, because we would love to talk about it forever. We both worked on it for several years. But as it is, I promise I will keep it to one slide and try and convert some of you to some moss first. So what you're looking at here is called sphagnum. It's what makes up most peat in the Arctic. So when people talk about carbon sequestration or the carbon that's stored in the Arctic, it's because of these little beauties. They're mostly alive at the top, and they compress, and so there's going to be a huge amount of organic matter stored in them. And they're very, very absorbent of any moisture, but they also survive when they dry out. So Indigenous people would often use them as diapers and things like that. That was what you would squeeze out the liquid, let them air dry, and then use it for, you could use it for wound dressing. They used it for all sorts of things. But one of my favorite asides, so if you look at the photo on the right, and you can see it says capsule and spores. And so that's the way that these, they don't have seeds, they have spores, and that's how they reproduce. But what happens in the summertime, again, that really hot period of July, if you're lucky enough to be working in these places or getting to see them, is that those capsules will actually pop. And if you're in a bog and it's very, very hot, if you're very, very quiet and you lay down, and you actually have to lay down and you can actually hear each one, tick, tick, tick. It's like the tiniest sound, but it's so cool because you can hear them burst, and you know that with each one of those bursts, all these spores are being released. Very, very cool, very beautiful moment of nature to get to witness. And another all-time favorite of the bogs, of the northern climates, which people often forget about. If you remember, I said before, it's a very nutrient-poor place, which means that it's actually host to several carnivorous plants. In fact, there are 18 carnivorous plants in Canada. Most of them do live in these northern reaches. So on the left, we're looking at the pitcher plant. They'll have inside, they have that, they're essentially a vessel holding that water, and they use that to trap insects. And then on the right, we have Drosera rotundifolia, which is the sundew. Very, very beautiful, very small. Look at your pinky nail. That's about the size of each one of those leaves that you're looking at. And that sap, excuse me, not sap, the sticky fluid around there, they've actually looked into trying to recreate that as an adhesive because it's so sticky. I think it's cool. I don't think it's commercially been done yet, but they were looking into it. And of course, you can't look at the north without looking at lichen, because where it's too dry for there to be moss, then surely the lichen have taken over. There's a quote somewhere that lichens survive in all the places where no one else can. And so the large photo we're looking at is called Reindeer Moss, which is a misnomer because it is a lichen. And just backtracking, so lichen is actually 2 organisms who live together in symbiosis. So you have a fungus and you have an algae that have essentially come together, and so you get the photosynthesis and you get the structure. So you can think about it as it's the furnace and the house, and they come together, and it's extremely slow growing. So to see, for context, the growth that you're seeing in that large zoomed in picture is only, I bet you it's 3-4 inches tall. And in order to achieve that, that's close to anywhere between 6 to 10 years of growth, depending on the region and the length of summer there. So it's very, 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 very dry, it can be very, very limiting because they have such a short growing period. They actually only usually grow spring and fall because summer is too dry and winter is frozen too cold. And so if you look in the wintertime, what the caribou will do is they'll go and they'll paw the snow, break off that crust there up top, and then eat the moss or the reindeer lichen underneath. And then in the summertime, when you walk across it and it's too dried out, it's so crazy to walk across, because every time you step, it just crunches through. And I know when I'm stepping across it that I'm stepping through years of growth. So it's a very, very fragile ecosystem, and it's sort of fascinating because the Arctic is so huge. There's a vast amount of this, right? This is the primary food source for caribou, and historically, caribou herds were, in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And so you would see the tracks, right? Like they would graze through an area and completely devastate it. The moss would be gone, the reindeer moss would be gone, and it would take years. So they wouldn't pass through that same area again to graze for years, because it would require that. But again, the Arctic is so vast, they could actually cycle through and graze that way, right? So it's a landscape that truly, to survive, you have to remain nomadic, because your resources are spread so thin. Another very cool grazer of the north is the Musk Ox, which I admit I have seen once. You wouldn't see, well, coming down to Churchill, you wouldn't see them very, very often, or if ever. As far as I know, there might be stories. Sometimes caribou make it down to Churchill, but the Musk Ox usually are a bit further north. But I remember I was quadding to a field site, and I turned a corner through the trees, and there was a juvenile male, 30 feet from me, and we both just sort of like paused, and eyes got big and looked at one another, because they're very aggressive. They're right. Their reaction is to charge at you, and so I was sort of awestruck, waiting, one, for to be able to see one, and two, waiting to see what it was going to do. And I think it was so shocked to see me that we eventually both went our separate ways. But there's something else to see. And an interesting aside is their wool. So to survive up north, they have the guard hairs, and they have a lighter sort of wool underneath, and that's worth more per ounce than cashmere. I think cashmere is about $12 to $14 US per ounce. Whereas if you can collect the wool from these in the north, they are domesticated in some places, but that's quite rare. It's about $35 US an ounce. So there was a point in time where some friends and I, that was our plan. We were going to go collect this from the Arctic, and that was going to be our big money, but it never panned out. But that's okay. It's good to have dreams like that. Yes. On to the food web. So I think the message I've been sort of circling around here is that the Arctic is very vast, right? Very vast. Resources are limited. And so I often make the comparison when you think about the ocean. I find that's easier for people to understand the Arctic ecosystem if we think about it as the ocean, right? The ocean is massive, and there's hot spots of diversity, all those different species. And so you have to cover a lot of ground. Or if you think about a whale, right? A large baleen whale like a humpback, you have to eat a large amount of krill in order to get your energy for the day. So the Arctic is very similar, right? There's a large number of species, not a lot of diversity, and it requires a lot of consumption of those in order to survive through. The other reason why I like to compare it to the ocean is because it gets rid of a certain misnomer that we have. So I purposely put this in here as a mistake, because I wanted to point it out. So if you're looking at the left food web, you can see the polar bear there, and that this is a terrestrial food web, which is not truly correct, because we call the polar bear a marine mammal because it truly is a marine mammal. Its sustenance is primarily from the ocean. Many of them will spend, my apologies for the cat. Many of them will spend their whole lives living on the sea ice, and they'll never even they'll be born on it, they'll die on it, they'll never even touch land. The Hudson Bay polar bears are a little different, because every time that summer ice melts in Hudson Bay, then they retreat to the coastline and wait for it to reform. But still, right, that's their home, that's where they thrive and survive. We just get to see them on Churchill in that window as they're making their voyage back onto the sea ice for hunting in the winter. And so I'm hoping to have changed your view of this a little bit. And thinking about all this space, it's sort of interesting because we've talked about who can survive in the Arctic and the different plants and some of the animals that are living on the tundra, but we haven't necessarily talked about why it is that it is so so barren. And obviously there's the cold, but a lot of it actually has to do with the development. So again, when we think back to geomorphology, so when we think about what made the landscape what it is today, we can focus in on a few different things. So one of them is the Laurentide ice sheet. So that, when we think about the last glacial maximum, that was about 10,000, 12,000 years ago, and it would have essentially scratched the surface bare, right? It's buried under kilometers of ice. If you look at where the words are, Hudson Bay is just north of those letters, more or less, right? So we're right in the center of this huge expanse of ice. So nothing's growing there, right? It's when you think about this ice retreating, it's essentially retreating and leaving behind a blank slate. So things have to start growing, soil has to start developing, right? And in that retreat is little stories left behind. So what you're looking at here, this is a section of bedrock, exposed bedrock, and you can see all the scratches in it. And so those scratches are actually, we call them glacial striations. And so when you think about those massive, massive chunks of ice, those ice sheets, as they thaw and freeze and slowly pull back, right? Because they do move, then there's a huge amount of pressure and weight, and there's a lot of friction. And so there's bits of gravel, there's larger rocks, sometimes they can be boulders, sometimes they can be massive, and they get pulled back and forth with that ice sheet. And so part of the way we know the evidence of this is through these striations. We can actually figure out the direction that the glaciers were moving based on the scratch marks. And I spent about a week of my life tied off with a climbing rope, hanging over an abandoned iron mine in northern Quebec, looking at these. We were looking at the scratch marks, and we were looking at the direction of the rocks laid behind, and you can actually map out where the glacier moved. It was a very, very cool time. It was definitely a little bit scary though, because you're sitting there looking at rocks, and you look over, and there was a lake at the bottom of the mine. So if the rope ever came undone, we were going for it's about a 200-foot tumble down. The other thing that the ice sheet left behind was large lakes, different places. The one that would have encompassed over Churchill is Lake Agassiz. So if you think about that ice sheet, it's almost like a bath stopper. It's melting and the water's building up beside it. And then until the ice sheet fully melted enough for the water to flow into the ocean, it just kept building and building water. So it was a massive, massive inland lake. And so now when you think about this, thinking about that blank slate, right? We've got the bare rock. The bare rock's finally exposed after being covered in ice for so long, and then it's underwater. And so it gets the characteristics of that. You're going to see coming to Churchill, a lot of the soil that is there is very sandy. You see glacial moraines left behind, right? You'll see that's where there is topsoil. It's mostly there as a function of that. And so the lake does eventually melt and drain, and drains into the ocean, and that actually has interesting effects on ocean currents. But we'll leave that as an aside. And the water that does remain on that landscape, when we think about the north, something we often forget about winter or summer is that the ground stays frozen, right? We call that permafrost. Sometimes it's discontinuous, so sometimes some spots of it thaw out, some of it don't. But when I was talking about bogs, when I was talking about these big wetlands, a big reason that is because of the permafrost, because you have the frozen ground, and so the water that's there is never allowed to drain. It often stays in these sort of hollows or there's deposits. And so the photo on the left, that really brown soil, that's that peat I was talking about. So that sphagnum moss, as it gets pressed down and it decays, it forms this really, it's what you would put in your gardens, right? That's what you often mix in, what people will buy to mix into their gardens, is that peat mix. And so that was the first ice core I ever pulled out with a hand auger. We were looking at that one day. And it really stuck, right? That it's all still so frozen down there, even though, you know, it's plus 20, the bugs are on us, the sun is shining. And so those are the processes that are keeping it this sort of resource poor environment, right? It's, if you think about it, it's relatively new, not for humans. When we think about it, our life scale is much shorter, but geologically, it's only had life growing on it the last 8,000 years, give or take. So there hasn't been time for you know, soil to develop, and the soil being frozen, excuse me, right, means that even fewer what can live there, it really limits what can survive, because you can't root very deep. Things are usually very rooted only superficially. The other reason why it's quite hard to live up there is because of the wind. So if you look at the tree on the left, we often call those flag trees. And so you can see that the upper 3/4 of it on the one side. And really that comes down to a predominant northwesterly wind. So that's driving all this cold Arctic air, and all of the plants have to put up with that. So if you're looking out for trees and in the subarctic, they're often very stunted, very small, but the age of them can be very impressive, right? When we most likely the age of the tree that we're looking at in this photo is probably close to 150 years, if not 200. It takes a long time for a tree in the subarctic to get above waist height. That is an accomplished tree if you're going to live up north. And another interesting note is, so I said that the top 2/3 is exposed because of the wind, but if you notice the bottom third, or quarter roughly, has branches all the way around. And so that we would call the snow skirt, right? So that's where in the wintertime the snow is built up around it, and it's able to withhold enough snow that it doesn't get worn away. So it's they're they're character building trees. It takes a lot to be a tree in the north. Now I feel like some of you might be covering your eyes or thinking, oh, you know, I just want to see the bears. But you know, it's something when you can appreciate what forms the animals and the plants that live there, right? So I often love to take those moments and take a step back in nature and see what it is that has made them the way they are, or how is it they were able to cultivate this niche in life. So I borrowed a quote from one of my favorite Disney movies, which is Mulan, and that is that the flower that blooms in adversity is the most rare and beautiful of all, which is a biased perspective of how I view the Arctic and the subarctic ecosystems. I think that what can survive up there, what can thrive up there, you know, is truly beautiful. And often, you know, when we're looking at some of those flowers, we're looking at the caribou, they're so well adapted to their environment. And yeah, it's one of my favorite places to be, summer or winter. And you know, summer, there's so many things that are beautiful and glowing, and wintertime is beautiful for a whole other reason, which right now I've really been focusing on, you know, having us look down, look at the ground, look at what we can see and feel. But now I want to take us a moment to look up. This is the other beauty of the north. I confess that this photo is not from Churchill, because you will not see those mountains. Where we're going is a low-lying land, but I have a very good photographer friend who took this photo of me, so I thought I would give a shout out to him. I still have to learn how to get the settings quite right. I'm not skilled enough yet, so once I can get my own photos, then I will get those of Churchill up here, I promise. The guests are always better at the photos than me when it comes to that. So yes, the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, the song in the sky, they are the result of solar winds. So from what we understand, right, we have the sun, and the sun actually emits electrons, protons, and those come hurtling towards our Earth. And as they get closer, we actually have a magnetic field, right? Because even though our Earth is solid, the core of our Earth is molten and moving slowly, but it is moving. And so that huge mass of iron interacts like a big giant magnet, hence we have our magnetic poles. And so magnetic magnetism affects those electrons and they get pulled to either end. And so we have really strong magnetic force in the center, but those poles, you almost think there's like a cleft or a chink in the armor of our magnetosphere. And that's where those electrons can come in. And so when they come in, think about it as, you know, slowing down at a stoplight, or thinking about it as the element if you have an electric stove top, think about the elements, right? So when it heats up, you know, the element is black or silver, and then it heats up and it turns red and it glows, right? So what's happening is that when those electrons enter our atmosphere, they're slowing down and they're really, really high energy. And when they slow down, that's when they give off light, because they have to give that. You can almost think about it as them losing the energy has to go somewhere, and it comes off as light, which is how we get these amazing, amazing shots, amazing things. And I can remember I've seen the Northern Lights several times. Where I grew up was very remote. It wasn't in the north, but it was very rural. And so I remember seeing them as a child, but I remember the first time I saw them going north. And they truly move, right? It's like watching a flag in the wind. And you really feel like it's dancing. It's something else. And so I will confess that Northern Lights during polar bear season can be hit and miss, because you're in challenge, or you're an opposite to another phenomenon going on, which is the sea ice, right? So there's a trade-off there. So before Hudson Bay freezes up, there's a lot of fog that gets created, and so it often shrouds the night sky. But then once the sea ice freezes, yay, the bears can go hunting, and the bears then head out, and then you can see the Northern Lights. So if Northern Lights are really what you want to go up north for, I would say check out the Northern Lights tour that kicks in January, February. It's like the trade-off. So you may or may not luck out and get to see Northern Lights on a polar bear trip, but you will have a very, very good odds of getting to see them once that sea ice is fully frozen, coming back in a few months later. So keep that in mind if that's on your northern bucket list. So as many of you come north and you're hoping to see the bears face to face, I always like to make the joke that, you know, people think that we bring you up there for you to see the bears, but really we bring you up there for the bears to see you. They sometimes like to get a lot close and personal. But I guess in summary, and thinking about this, everything I've shared with you so far, is that I'm asking you to stop and love the bears, focus on the bears. I'm happy to talk your ear off about bears, but also stop and look at the environment around them. You know, look at the Hudson Bay, look at the open ocean as it freezes, look at that bedrock, you know, those willow thickets that they're sleeping in, and there's so much life that's also there. And you know, there's two sides to the coin. It's the world we're seeing it now with its frozen glaze. I almost think about it as the world is frosted when you're there during Churchill season, during polar bear season, excuse me. But in the summertime, it's this mosaic of different life. So the tundra is really this beautiful, beautiful environment that I find so few people get the opportunity to experience. And so bringing to life that snow-covered thicket, you know, we're going to be looking into this thicket because that's often where the polar bears like to take a nap while they're waiting for the sea ice to freeze up. You'll see, you know, sometimes you get see mom and cubs tucked in there, snoozing the day away. But those thickets, you know, they're sort of fantastic. This is a different landscape again, obviously, but it's the same species, which I think is biologically something cool to highlight. So if you look at that ridge, the yellow side is a mixture of poplar and birch, but the maroon side, or the sort of purplish red side, those are those willows and dwarf birches, and they're growing on the north side of that slope because that's what can survive there, right? So you're seeing that they've carved out a niche for themselves in an alpine environment, in the tundra environment. They're brilliant. And so we're going to look for polar bears, and we're going to scout for them. And I'm also hoping that you will also keep your eyes open for the ptarmigan. You know, we might even find some uncovered spots and see what other species that we can find. I usually try and dig up some lichen at some point, one way or another. So keeping our eyes open, you know, we're gonna see that bear as they wake up. This was a juvenile who was smell testing. They'll often kind of snooze for a bit, then they'll wake up and they'll smell and see who else is around. And then if they're feeling comfortable, they'll go right back to sleeping. Or we're gonna look, and the most exciting moment, but for you, might be the first time you see mom and cubs. There's nothing quite like it. It really is this spectacular moment, and you kind of, even for myself going back, right, your heart still kind of stops, and you just pause and take a deep breath and realize what the moment is that you get to be a part of. But also my favorite moments sometimes are just a lot simpler than that. And so coming in a few months here, I know I'm getting excited to return to Churchill, and I hope very earnestly to get to share that experience with many of you. So thank you so much for your time and for your attention, and I hope that you'll give the Tundra another look, and I'll pass that off to Colby.
Thank you, Christina. We really appreciate it. It was very insightful. It was fun to hear of your research exploits, and being able to see the Churchill area and the tundra through all of the seasons was really inspiring. So thanks for doing that. Before we start the Q&A, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your own questions via the questions field in your control panel. Some folks have been doing that all along, so we'll get started here. Christina, we have a viewer curious, when is the best time to see wildflowers, and are there any still remaining for bear season?
Yeah, so wildflowers, it will always change, right? Because you think about our summer, right? Different flowers peak. So probably June is going to be your best crossover. Well, actually, yeah, end of June is probably your best mix, because sometimes, what we call spring or summer doesn't kick in there until end of May, is when, all the snow really leaves. As far as bear season, you won't catch any wildflowers. You might not be snowed in if you come early. You'll still get to see probably some of the different lichen species and things like that, but you'll have missed the flower window. But there is a beluga trip in the summertime, which I think is in August. So I think that would be a combo if you wanted to come see some beautiful whales and see some wildflowers. You might have a better chance. Colby, maybe you can speak to that. I still haven't done the Beluga Trail.
Yeah, July and August is wonderful, and yeah, you're right. The wildflower season starts up in late June, and it goes well through July. So any of those trips, and then depending on the year, even into August, quite a ways, you'll still get some really nice ones. Like you said, things come in waves depending on the type of wildflower, the particular species. So there are different things blooming throughout the summer. I think July is usually meant to be the peak. Thanks, Christina. You were talking about lichens and mosses earlier, and a question came up. What is the difference between a spore and a seed?
Yeah, so spores are often genetically, you can have two different types of spores. So first of all, I won't go into this too much, but some spores are clones, so they're genetically exact same to their parent. Some spores are a mix of different the same as a seed that way, or half of each parent material. So you would have the genetic diversity. So that's one thing that can be a difference. Also, they're structured different. So spores don't have a food bank reserve. They don't have, or like the flesh around the right. When you think about, then they won't have a coating. And there's another technical difference. You're very good. I haven't had to pull this out of my brain since like biology 202. There's another defining difference, but it has to do with the morphology and usually the genetics.
Yeah, complicated little creatures, aren't they? For sure. Thanks for that. Let's switch over to mammals. Where would a person need to go to see caribou and muskox?
Ooh, yeah. So the muskox were very nearly wiped out in the 80s. Well, they were wiped out in Alaska. They survived in Canada. So as far as caribou and muskox, your best bets would potentially be Northwest Territories. It's more accessible than none of it. It's kind of there's still a road into Northwest Territories, whereas Nunavut, essentially all the communities are fly-in. But as far as sustained and like ecotourism friendly accessible herds of muskox, I don't know. Caribou you can see honestly in quite a few different places. In there, I would say they're full on splendor. You need to go proper tundra, but there's a few sub what's the word I'm trying to say here? There's a few smaller herds that are in northern Alberta, a little bit into northern Saskatchewan. There's some that come down. There's every now and again there's one or two caribou that makes it into Churchill. I always think it's funny because usually, everyone comes to Churchill to see the polar bears and the locals get excited. Like, hey, did you hear the caribou are back?
Yeah, I can think of a number of years where we've had early season caribou, particularly for the people that are on the ultimate trips that have the helicopters, or have booked a helicopter because we fly over the national park. So usually those October trips, we still have pretty good luck witnessing them, and it's quite spectacular to see the herds moving through the tundra from the helicopter, right? That classic sort of National Geographic shot. You're speaking about musk ox earlier and the value of their fur. The question came up: is there poaching because of that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. So there isn't really, because they're so hard to get to. I think if you would have gone to the 80s and 90s, but essentially now most of it is collected. There's a few domestic herds where they collect it from. But otherwise, it essentially, the way that they shed is it falls off in these large clumps. And so if you follow the route, you can often go and pick it up behind there. So it's not, yeah, it's not as, poaching is less of a concern for muskox, at least not in the same way as some of the African species have to contend with. So I guess we can be grateful for that.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll stick with mammals here, Christina. I'll pair a few questions together for you about Arctic hare. So are there Arctic hare in Churchill? Could you see them during polar bear season, and how big are they?
Yeah, so there are. That was true. That was one I didn't throw in this time around. They are up there. Comparative. I'm trying to think of a different hare species that we could compare them to. They're certainly. I'm trying to think in weight wise whether they would be around 8 pounds maybe. They're not overly big. They're a bit because their fur gets so fluffy. They get quite fluffy, so they're a bit misconceiving on their size, but they're not terribly large. And I would argue that they're as hard to spot as the ptarmigan, if not harder. You mostly catch them just out of your corner of the eye. You need to catch the fleeting motion, and then you can track them. But if they're just sitting still to find one, it's a bit of a challenge, but they are there. Oh, did I lose you, Colby?
Oh, apologies, I had my mic on mute. We have a question about bears, and I think you did a good job setting expectations today, because most of the questions are about the ecosystem and not the bears. But you showed a picture with the polar rovers. And so how come the bears come around the polar rovers? Is it because they're curious?
Yeah, it's largely a curiosity thing, and you can tell that also by the age bracket of bears that come to say hi, because it's usually the younger ones, the juvenile ones, who are more curious, whereas the older bears who've been around longer, they very rarely, kind of they just like, oh yeah, it's you again, right? But the younger ones still like, oh, what's this? And they come to take a look out of curiosity is the main reason. I mean, and also you do have to remember this is still an apex predator, right? So regardless of what you and I may think about being in a 14, 15 foot massive tundra rover feeling quite high in predator, like they're still always assessing everything as, essentially they only split it into two things. Are you something worth eating or are you not? So there's still always part of their brain that's kind of calculating that. And I often I thought about this once because you see a lot of bears doing field work, and usually it's grizzly bears and black bears, right? And I've often thought about this because people always think about polar bears as the most, what's the word I'm trying to say? Like they always have that the cutest expression, right? And I used to think about that working in the field after doing a polar bear season, and I came across a black bear, and it clicked in my head why that cute expression stays around. And it's because for myself, anyways, when I've come across black bears and the odd grizzly, there's a moment where they're deciding what you are. Are you food, foe, friend, right? There's three categories. And so there's a moment of, as the animal, there's the same as the human, but there's a moment of fear of trying to figure out what you are and what to do with you. And so that's when you often see the lips curl. You'll see what we consider facial expressions of aggression. Whereas when you see a polar bear, there's very few of those moments of expression. Actually, when I think about my ears, and maybe Colby, you can comment to this, but when they're looking at us, they very rarely show aggression because they're never classifying us as a threat. You're either food or you're something that I don't bother with, but they don't really think about us as a threat.
Yeah, that's the scary thing about polar bears, and of course is why we're in those big polar rovers, right? So we can be safe and enjoy them out there. Christina, thank you so much for your time. This is the last question we have time for today. So with that, how about I'll hand it back to you for a closing comment today.
Sure thing. Thank you everyone for sticking around and enjoying the Tundra with me. I really enjoyed getting to unearth some old field photos and remember some of these really, truly wonderful places I've gotten to work in. So for me, this was a wonderful trip down memory lane, and I will be my greatest honor both to share the bears with you and share some bear stories, but also to share some more Tundra stories. So by all means, take a look into Churchill. It's a wonderful place. And as it is, I hope you have a lovely day.
All right, thanks again, Christina. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate it. Join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation and we'll have the replay available shortly on our website. And with that, I will conclude today's webinar. Thank you, everyone.